The 1970s blew animation wide open. This wasn't Disney, this wasn't Saturday morning cartoons. This was the decade when animators mixed politics, violence, and sexuality in ways no studio had tried before. And the result was chaos. Governments banned them, theaters refused them, parents left with children in tears. Here are 10 animated films from the 1970s that were banned, censored, or buried for decades. And trust us, you won't believe what happened with number 3. Number 10, Coonskin, 1975. In 1975, Ralph Bakshi released Coonskin, a film that instantly split audiences and censors. It blended live action and animation, following Brother Rabbit, Preacher Fox, and Brother Bear as they hustled through Harlem's criminal underworld. The trio dreamed of power and survival, but were drawn as exaggerated minstrel-style caricatures, echoing America's ugliest cartoon traditions. Bakshi's intent was sharp satire, to hold a mirror up to the racism woven into popular culture. But for many, the message never landed. They saw only old stereotypes revived on screen, and the outrage was immediate. The backlash began even before the premiere. The very title sparked protests. The Congress of Racial Equality organized picket lines outside theaters, and a young activist named Al Sharpton was among the voices demanding the film be pulled. Crowds gathered with placards in hand, chanting at ticket lines as confused moviegoers tried to enter. Paramount Pictures, originally set to distribute Coonskin, quickly grew nervous and dropped it. Across the United States, theaters refused to show the film or pulled it after one night of angry crowds. Some audiences booed and walked out mid-screening. In city after city, Coonskin was driven underground, not by law but by protests, distributors, and theater owners. Critics, too, were sharply divided. Some praised Bakshi's film as fearless social commentary, while others condemned it as unredeemable exploitation. For more than a decade, it was nearly impossible to see. Only in the late 1980s did the film resurface under the new title, Street Fight, where it slowly found a cult following. Today, scholars often revisit it as one of the boldest animated critiques of race in America. A piece of art that dared to confront prejudice with uncomfortable imagery. But in 1975, Coonskin was radioactive, a cartoon too explosive for its own time. And if Coonskin was chased out by protests, the next film was chased out by projectionists, a foul-mouthed duck who never even made it through the reels. Number 9, Down and Dirty Duck, 1974. In 1974, audiences stumbled into a film that even midnight movie fans weren't sure they could sit through. Down and Dirty Duck, sometimes shortened to just Dirty Duck, came from Roger Corman's New World Pictures, a studio already notorious for testing boundaries. But this time, even Corman himself backed away. The film followed Willard, a meek insurance clerk whose life collides with a foul-mouthed, wisecracking duck. From there, the plot unraveled into a surreal road trip, drug-laced desert hallucinations, biker gangs, wizards, brothels, and wild parties, all drawn in crude, underground comic style. It was part cartoon, part fever dream, and part dare to see just how far animators could push the medium. The MPAA branded it with an X rating, sealing its fate. Most theaters refused to book it. In some cities, like Boston and Chicago, authorities banned it outright. Elsewhere, managers pulled the reels mid-show once they realized what was playing. For many distributors, it was easier to bury the duck than risk angry crowds. Variety dismissed it as animation that makes Ralph Bakshi look like Walt Disney. Critics hammered it, and audiences expecting counterculture satire often walked out in shock. Still, the 1970s fed cult cinema. Dirty Duck found small life in college towns and dingy midnight screenings, where its sheer audacity earned a following. Musicians like Frank Zappa praised its raw energy, and the film's animators later pivoted to far cleaner projects, including work on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. For a film once banned in practice, its legacy turned out stranger than fiction. Down and Dirty Duck wasn't erased by governments or lawsuits. It was silenced by projectionists, theater chains, and the unspoken limits of what audiences were willing to tolerate. And if one duck could be shut down this way, the next parody proved that sometimes the lawyers got there first. Number 8, Tarzoon, Shame of the Jungle, 1975. In 1975, European audiences were introduced to a jungle hero unlike any they had ever seen. Tarzoon, Shame of the Jungle, later shortened to Shame of the Jungle, was a French-Belgian parody of Tarzan made to push every possible button. It was crude, juvenile, and brazenly sexual, with animation so absurd that even the Tarzan estate filed a lawsuit to stop it. The story followed Tarzoon, a gangly jungle dweller, on a mission to rescue his kidnapped girlfriend from the villainous Queen Bazanga, a towering figure whose exaggerated anatomy became the film's most infamous sight gag. Her army of strange phallic-shaped henchmen marched across the screen in sequences that left audiences somewhere between laughter and horror. But parody didn't protect it from backlash. The Tarzan estate successfully sued, forcing the film to drop the Tarzoon name in the United States and be marketed only as Shame of the Jungle. Even then, the controversies didn't stop. In New Zealand, it was outright banned in 1976 as obscene. Other countries trimmed minutes of footage before allowing screenings. In America, distributors cut 20 minutes of the most extreme content, yet the MPAA still stamped it with an X rating. Women's groups protested, arguing that the film's juvenile treatment of sexuality went far beyond satire. And yet, despite the backlash, the film had an audience. In France, it sold tickets in droves, reportedly outgrossing The Godfather Part 2 in some regions. It became a midnight movie staple in Europe and later in the US, where its notoriety was amplified by the voices of comedians John Belushi and Bill Murray in the English dub. Shame of the Jungle was a paradox. A parody so crude it landed in court, banned in some countries, trimmed to ribbons in others, yet celebrated as underground comedy elsewhere. If Dirty Duck showed how theaters could silence a cartoon, Shame of the Jungle proved that sometimes the lawyers struck the final blow. But the next film didn't need courts or censors. It twisted childhood fairy tales into something so obscene that even Mother Goose herself was dragged into the spotlight. Number 7. Once Upon a Girl. In 1976, audiences discovered that even fairy tales weren't safe. Once Upon a Girl promised to retell childhood classics, but instead of bedtime stories, it delivered bawdy, X-rated comedy sketches. The film blended live action with animation, casting Mother Goose herself as the narrator, or rather, as the defendant in a trial for obscenity. From her witness stand, she defended her stories by presenting new versions of Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, and Jack and the Beanstalk. But these weren't the gentle tales parents remembered. Red's trip through the forest turned into a risque encounter. Cinderella's magical evening was played for crude laughs. Even Jack's climb up the beanstalk became an excuse for a string of innuendos. The animation style looked like Saturday morning cartoons, only garish, exaggerated, and laced with adult gags that made the contrast even more jarring. The framing segments leaned on familiar voices too. Hal Smith, best known for voicing Owl in Disney's Winnie the Pooh, played the judge in the obscenity trial. Critics noted the irony, a children's entertainer lending his voice to what many dismissed as smut. The Motion Picture Association wasted no time stamping the film with an X rating, cutting off access to mainstream theaters. In conservative towns, rental shops that later stocked it were raided and the tapes confiscated as obscene material. Critics were brutal. Newspapers dismissed it as crude juvenilia, while parents' groups accused it of corrupting childhood staples. For most of America, Once Upon a Girl simply didn't exist, but in the margins, it gained notoriety. By the 1980s, it was circulating on bootleg VHS tapes, sometimes mislabeled as a lost Disney cartoon. That strange afterlife only deepened its cult reputation. In the end, the movies became a time capsule of the 1970s, a decade when even fairy tales were put on trial. And while Once Upon a Girl faded into obscurity, the next entry proved that obscurity was safer. Because the cartoon cat who came before had already been banned across entire countries. Number 6. Fritz the Cat. In 1972, Ralph Bakshi took a college campus comic strip and turned it into the first X-rated animated feature in history. Fritz the Cat wasn't just a cartoon, it was a cultural explosion. Based on Robert Crumb's underground comics, the film followed Fritz, a restless feline drifting through riots, drugs, jazz clubs, and free love escapades. It was brash, crude, and relentlessly political, a satire of America's counterculture seen through the eyes of a talking cat. The style was unlike anything audiences had seen. Instead of polished Disney gloss, Bakshi gave viewers grimy New York streets filled with anthropomorphic characters who smoked, fought, and slept their way through the chaos. The soundtrack pumped with jazz and blues, grounding the cartoon in a real urban atmosphere. The backlash was immediate. The Motion Picture Association branded it with an X rating, and theaters quickly refused to screen it. In the United States, screenings were canceled under pressure from parent groups and city boards. Abroad, it was banned outright in countries like the UK, Italy, and Finland. In some cities that did screen it, managers yanked the reels mid-show after outraged walkouts. Critics split down the middle. Roger Ebert famously praised it for daring to push animation into new territory, while others dismissed it as vulgar provocation. Ironically, the controversy only fueled its success. Made for less than $1 million, Fritz the Cat went on to gross nearly $90 million worldwide, a return so staggering it stunned Hollywood. Yet Crumb, the original creator, despised the adaptation so much that he killed Fritz in his comics soon after, drawing him crushed by an ice pick. Decades later, the film is remembered as the work that broke animation's innocence wide open. It asked whether cartoons could be political, sexual, and adult in ways that mattered, and its success proved there was an audience ready to find out. But Bakshi wasn't done. His next film would go darker, more personal, and leave even more theaters refusing to play it. Number 5. Heavy Traffic. In 1973, Ralph Bakshi doubled down. Fresh off the scandal of Fritz the Cat, he released Heavy Traffic, a film that made his earlier work look almost tame. This time, the story was semi-autobiographical, drawn from Bakshi's own New York upbringing. The film follows Michael, a young cartoonist living in a crumbling apartment with his Jewish mother and Italian father. His life unravels into a pinball game of violence, gang fights, racial tension, and fleeting romance. At times, the movie shifts from gritty animation to sudden bursts of live-action footage, making the line between reality and art uncomfortably thin. Instead of escapism, Bakshi gave audiences a mirror of the city's chaos. The imagery was relentless. Domestic abuse, drug deals in alleys, and brawls between rival street gangs were rendered with the same rough, urgent animation that made his characters feel both cartoonish and disturbingly real. The film's soundtrack, packed with doo-wop, Motown, and rock tracks, only heightened the sense that this was less a story and more a lived-in memory of 1970s urban America. The censors balked. The MPAA slapped it with an X rating, limiting where it could play. Italy, South Africa, and parts of Canada refused to classify it at all, effectively banning it. In the US, many theaters wouldn't touch it, while others screened it only in late-night grindhouses. Television networks and festivals excluded it from retrospectives of animation, as if to erase it from the medium's history. Yet critics who did see it were stunned. The Village Voice hailed it as the taxi driver of animation, and Martin Scorsese himself praised its raw honesty. For Bakshi, it was proof that animation could capture the same brutality as live action, maybe even more so. Despite the refusals, the film earned over $1.5 million on a $400,000 budget and built a cult following. Decades later, creators behind shows like Adult Swim cited it as a direct influence. But for audiences in 1973, Heavy Traffic was more than a cartoon. It was a raw, unfiltered portrait of a city on the edge, too bleak for most theaters to handle. And if Heavy Traffic blurred the line between life and animation, the next film crossed into something else entirely. It looked like a watercolor painting, but played like a scream. Number 4. Belladonna of Sadness. In 1973, Japan released an animated film so strange and so overwhelming that it nearly vanished from history. Belladonna of Sadness was unlike anything else of its time. Part watercolor painting, part fever dream, and part feminist howl disguised as exploitation. The story followed Jeanne, a peasant bride whose wedding night ends in tragedy when she is assaulted by her lord. Stripped of her dignity and home, she makes a pact with a devilish spirit who promises power in exchange for submission. What unfolds is a journey through witchcraft, rebellion, and betrayal, painted in images that shift like hallucinations. Many scenes play less like animation and more like a living art book, where watercolor figures stretch, dissolve, and transform across the screen. Audiences in 1973 weren't ready. The violence and sexual imagery pushed beyond what Japanese censors would tolerate. Demands for cuts were met with refusal, and the film flopped at the box office. Its studio, Mushi Production, once a giant of anime, collapsed into bankruptcy soon after. International distributors wouldn't touch it. For decades, the movie survived only in fragments and bootlegs, whispered about by critics who had managed to see rare prints. But those who did see it never forgot. Japan's leading film magazine called it animation that denies being animation, a piece of art that refused to be boxed into any category. In the West, filmmakers like Gaspar Noé later cited its dreamlike sequences as direct influences. When a restored version finally re-emerged in 2016, critics reappraised it not as mere exploitation, but as a haunting allegory of oppression and resistance. In its own time, though, Belladonna of Sadness was too much, too raw, too daring. A painting that screamed when it was supposed to soothe. And if Belladonna proved art could be dangerous, the next film showed what happens when a government decides even puppets can't be trusted. Number 3. The Hand. In the mid-1960s, Czech animator Jiří Trnka released a short film that would become both his masterpiece and his undoing. It was called The Hand, a stop-motion story that ran barely 18 minutes, but it terrified a government more than any obscene cartoon ever could. The story seems simple at first. A cheerful little puppet spends his days sculpting pots and tending flowers in a tiny home filled with warmth. Then a giant gloved hand appears, demanding he stop making art for himself and instead build a statue honoring the hand. When he refuses, the hand smashes his clay pots, scatters his flowers, and tears apart the little room he worked in. The silence is deafening. No dialogue, no narration, just the creak of strings and the sound of everything he loves being destroyed. In the end, the puppet is imprisoned, broken, and finally buried with false honors inside a cage shaped like a trophy. Audiences understood immediately what the censors pretended not to see. The hand was the state, crushing individual expression under authoritarian rule. For a few years, the film slipped through, praised as a masterpiece of animation. But after Trnka's death in 1969, the authorities struck back. By the early 1970s, the reels were seized, theaters were warned, and the film was locked away in government vaults. To screen The Hand was forbidden anywhere in the Eastern Bloc. For almost 2 decades, the little puppet's struggle vanished behind the Iron Curtain. Western animators whispered about it, calling it Disney's nightmare under communism. Film schools taught its message as legend, even when students couldn't see a single frame. When communism finally fell in 1989, The Hand re-emerged to international acclaim. Today, it stands as one of the most important political animations ever made, proof that even puppets can carry a message sharp enough to frighten a government. But censorship didn't always come from one government. In the next entry, it was an entire Eastern Bloc, terrified of a surreal science fiction allegory. Number 2. Fantastic Planet. In 1973, French director René Laloux and Czech artist Roland Topor unveiled a film that looked nothing like the Disney era of animation. Fantastic Planet, or La Planète Sauvage, was a psychedelic allegory where delicate cutout figures floated through surreal hand-painted landscapes. It won the special jury prize at Cannes, but in much of Eastern Europe, it never even reached theaters. The story takes place on a distant planet ruled by the Drags, towering blue giants who keep humans, or Oms, as pets. Some Oms live in cages, dressed and handled like toys. Others survive wild, hunted down and exterminated when their numbers grow too large. When one human, Ter, escapes captivity, he discovers the Drag society, technology, and meditation rituals, and begins to plot rebellion. On its surface, the film is dreamlike. Birds glide across crimson skies, alien flora pulse with strange life. The Drags sit cross-legged, their glowing eyes closed in meditation. But beneath the fantasy, audiences recognize the allegory, small, oppressed people rising against a controlling power. To those living under Soviet influence, it was impossible not to see echoes of their own reality. That was enough to get the film restricted. While Fantastic Planet was celebrated in France and the United States, reels struggled to circulate in the Eastern Bloc. Some screenings were canceled before they began. In Czechoslovakia, where parts of it had been animated, the Soviet-led invasion of 1968 cast a long shadow. Films seen as anti-authority were pulled or shelved, and Fantastic Planet slipped into semi-illegal circulation. Watched in private clubs, passed between students, whispered about more than it was actually seen. Yet in the West, it flourished. Midnight theaters embraced it as the perfect counterculture experience, often paired with Pink Floyd records or incense-fueled double bills. College students clung to its surrealism, and critics compared it to Gulliver's Travels, a fable too strange and too biting to be ignored. By the time the Eastern Bloc eased restrictions in the late 1980s, Fantastic Planet was already a cult classic abroad. Today it stands as proof that even the gentlest, most painterly animation could frighten entire governments, not with vulgarity or shock, but with allegory. And then came the final entry, a film with no allegory at all, marketed as a children's story but horrifying families in broad daylight. Number 1. Watership Down. In 1978, Britain released what looked like the gentlest of films. Posters showed wide-eyed rabbits against green fields. The rating certificate stamped it U, suitable for all ages. Parents brought their children expecting a harmless adventure about bunnies. What they got instead was one of the most harrowing animated films ever made. Watership Down, based on Richard Adams's best-selling novel, followed a group of rabbits fleeing the destruction of their warren. Led by Hazel and guided by the visions of a frail seer named Fiver, they cross fields, rivers, and farmlands in search of safety. But every step is shadowed by violence. Hawks swoop from the sky, dogs tear through undergrowth, other rabbits turn savage, their claws and teeth tearing at intruders. When Hazel's band stumbles into the militaristic warren of General Woundwort, the story explodes into full-scale war, with rabbits bleeding, gasping, and dying on screen. Children cried in theaters. Parents wrote furious letters. The British Board of Film Classification was flooded with complaints. How could something this violent be rated for children? Officials had assumed the gentle animation style made it safe. Instead, families left with nightmares. For decades, the film's U certificate became one of the most contested ratings in UK history. Some television networks tried to soften the blow with disclaimers, but the images, rabbits snared and strangled, fields soaked in blood, spoke for themselves. In some communities, schools and councils quietly discouraged screenings. Abroad, countries often raised the age rating, putting it closer to teen audiences than children. Only in 2023, nearly 45 years later, did the UK officially raise the rating to PG, finally acknowledging what parents had known all along. Yet despite the controversy, Watership Down endured. Its theme song Bright Eyes topped charts, its visuals influenced decades of animators, and its refusal to soften death gave it a haunting honesty. It wasn't obscene, it wasn't satirical, it was truthful about the brutality of nature. And that may be why it remains the most infamous banned cartoon of the 1970s, not because governments feared it, but because parents did. It proved that sometimes the most frightening thing animation can do is tell the truth. The 1970s proved animation was never just child's play. From parodies dragged into courtrooms to allegories locked in vaults, these films showed that drawings could challenge power, unsettle audiences, and even change culture. Some were crude, some poetic, some terrifying, but all were too bold for their own time. They weren't simply banned cartoons, they were rebellions drawn on paper, reminders that even the softest lines can leave the deepest scars.